All right, good people. Hello and welcome back to Civics Unit 8. This is our second lesson within our Government and the Economy unit. We are going to do kind of three things in one today. So the first large section of our lesson is going to be about circular flow in the business cycle. So we'll dig into what is an economy, how does it work over time, how does money flow around in and outside of the United States, and then kind of circling back to our economy, how do we know how it's doing? And then that'll lead us into kind of how we trade with other nations and what we can do if our economy is maybe in a state that we don't particularly care for as a nation and as a government. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it, like our friend Tabitha Brown says. All right, so when we talk about circular flow, this is where we're going to start. So we kind of dug in our previous lesson about wants versus needs. We dug into supply and demand, kind of goods and services, producers, consumers, and we discussed kind of very broadly how money flows. But today we're going to zoom in just a little closer, and we're going to dig into these four major entities that help money flow around, these four major big chunks of institutions. So this one at the top should be government. This is Capitol Hill, where our federal government or our federal lawmakers come and hang out. On the left side is the House of Representatives, and on the right side is the Senate. All right, over here on the left is households. On the right would be business firms, and at the bottom we'll have banks. So we're going to start in the middle, and you're going to want to leave a little bit of room in your note sheet. We're going to need one pair of arrows around the outside and then two pairs of arrows on the inside. So we talked about consumers and producers yesterday. A producer is a person or a business that makes a good or a service, and then a consumer is someone who uses a good or a service. Now, both business firms, and firm is just a more formal economic term for a business. All right, firms and households, both of them can be a consumer or a producer depending on the situation. So I went ahead and marked a little C for consumer and then a P for producer. So we're going to start with consumer, and again, we're going to need two arrows for the consumer section, two for the producer section. They'll look like this. Okay, so now if a household is a consumer, if I as a person am a consumer, what I am giving over here to business firms is my money, and in exchange, I receive goods and services. And we know, because we're intelligent, that goods and services are not quite the same thing. They're related. They can both be exchanged for money as a function of money. But a good is something that you can hold, and a service is something you pay someone to do. So, for example, children that I teach know that I love going to Moe's. If I walk into Moe's and I'm there to receive dinner, I am being a consumer of that good, all right? So I have walked into Moe's, I have given them money, and in exchange, I receive my quesadilla as a good. Now, if I'm a producer and I'm going to Moe's to clock in and put in a 6 or 7 hour shift, this time I am not a producer. This time I'm not a consumer. I am a producer. All right, so we'll have two arrows at the bottom. I'm not sure where they're like clear like that. So I'll be a producer this time. Now, in the flip side of this, I'm not going to give money to a business. I'm there to receive money. I'm giving them my time, my effort, and we can go ahead and characterize this as our labor. So if you are a producer, you are putting your labor into this, and in exchange, you receive a wage or a salary. So a wage is earned by the hour, and a salary is earned by the year. All right, and like I said earlier, we'll only have one set of arrows for all of these around. And these are a little more simple. So the middle two are the ones that kind of are the biggest chunk for us to remember, because remember, these two entities, both households and business firms, can serve as both consumers and producers. All right, so when we talk about a consumer and how they interact in terms of money with the government, anybody who earns a paycheck at some point in their life is going to complain about the amount of taxes that they pay. So on this arrow on the outside here, from households up to government, should be taxes. And in exchange, the government is supposed to provide services for its citizens. Now, this could be any level of government, federal, state, or local. This could be public schools. This could be roads that don't have gigantic potholes in them. This could be the United States Armed Services, so any armed forces, excuse me, so any of our 6 branches of the military. So that's taxes versus services. All right, now the same thing can be said for a business firm. All right, so even if you're an individual, if you are a person who owns a small business, you do provide taxes to the government, and in exchange, they're supposed to provide you with services like even more detailed sending mail, prisons, court systems, public transportation, things like that. So taxes are taken from both households and business firms. So these arrows across the top, they match. They are the same set of circumstances. The only difference is what entity they are coming from. All right. Now, the same thing can be said for banks. So you as an individual, things that you put into the bank, the money that you put into a bank is typically called a deposit. All right, so households on these inside 2 arrows. All right, and then we only have one more set of arrows over here, and that will round out our arrows in general. All right, so households give deposits into a bank and receive what's called, or also deposit what's called APR, or their annual percentage rate. This is also known as interest. So it's essentially just your fee for continuing to borrow money. All right, and in exchange, a bank can give you interest if you put your money in there and leave it alone, and they also issue out loans. All right, so as an individual, you can deposit money into the bank, you can give interest and payments back to a bank, and in exchange, they can give you payments for larger things that you cannot purchase on your own and you have to purchase on credit and kind of give back over time. And the same thing can be said for a business firm. So these last 2 arrows, these green ones over here, are the same thing. All right, so essentially, households and business firms function in much the same way in terms of circular flow. So a business firm, if somebody has received a small business loan, let's say, for example, I open a gym, okay, and I decide that I want my gym to have a second location. Maybe I go to the state employees credit union, I ask for a small business loan, and I am going to deposit my payments in and deposit my interest in, and in exchange, I receive that loan and they pay me interest if maybe I have a savings account and I leave it alone for a while. All right, so that is circular flow. Now, when we move along to okay, we'll scoot back here for just a second. This little section over here is called the foreign sector. We won't dig into that too much today. We'll get into that more when we talk about global economy and trade. All right, so the business cycle, if we were to put the United States economy and kind of like how we function as a government, all the stuff that we produce as a country, onto a graph, it would look like a roller coaster. So make sure you are using all of that space inside these axes, left to right. Really take that up so that you can write some things on all sides of these curves. Okay, so all sides of this little roller coaster track. All right, so when we talk about a business cycle, the lowest point that our government and the stuff that we can produce as a country can reach is called a trough. All right, and a trough is just the term for our lowest point. And much like you have in life, you don't typically know when you've reached your lowest point until you have come out of it and you're kind of like back on the uptick again. So the same thing can be said for our economy. Now, when our economy is growing and we're doing better, maybe people are spending more money, businesses are opening, people get raises, people get hired. This is called an expansion. All right, so once you hit rock bottom, the only direction that you can go is up. Now, how quickly or slowly we expand out our economy depends on a whole bunch of different factors, but this is an expansion overall. Once we hit the top of this, it's called a peak, just like a mountain. All right, we can think of this as like a little business cycle roller coaster. All right, and once we have hit the peak time, the highest and the best that our economy can possibly be, we come back down again towards a trough, because once you get to the top of the mountain, the only direction you can go is down. All right, we call that a recession. We don't want to stay in this section of the business cycle. All right, this is a recession. We'll get into that a little more when we talk about fiscal and monetary policy. Now, a super low trough, we've only had a handful of really, really difficult low troughs in our nation's history, thank goodness. A really low trough is called a depression, the most notable of which is the Great Depression. You've probably heard of it at some point. You may have heard your grandparents speak about it, great-grands, your parents, somebody in your life at some point has probably talked about the Great Depression. All right, so this is an unusually low trough. Troughs are natural, troughs are normal in an economic cycle, but a super low one is not normal. All right, so during an expansion, like we talked about beforehand, if our economy is expanding, that means people are spending more money, people have more money to spend. That means more jobs, people might receive a raise in their wage or their salary. Businesses, if they see that the economy is doing well, they are more likely to open a business or maybe even open more businesses than the ones that exist. And people are spending more cash because we know if people have money, they spend it. The second that you break a $100 bill, it disappears into thin air because you have bought stuff with it. Now, on the other hand, during a recession, this is the opposite. People are like, they know we're headed towards a trough, and people naturally want to save money during a recession. Now, some negative consequences of a recession, like once we've hit that peak and we've kind of moved over to the recession side of the business cycle, there might be some layoffs. This is not the same as being fired. Okay, if you are fired, that means that you have done something wrong according to your employer. A layoff simply means that your employer can no longer afford to pay you. That is of no fault of your own. Okay, that cannot be held against you when you are trying to seek new employment. All right, so layoff is not the same as being fired. Just a thing to think about. All right, and during a recession, you might also receive a pay cut because if people have less money coming in, businesses are not receiving as much profit. They don't have as much money to pay the people that they do currently employ. All right, and businesses might decide to close because of this. All right, so when we talk about the business cycle and government, the ideal place that we want to be in the cycle is in an expansion as long as humanly possible, and we want to get out of a recession as quickly as humanly possible because we know once we're in an expansion, we're going to hit a peak at some point and go back down the mountain. So we want to expand, kind of like when a roller coaster kind of like clicks up the big tall like drop at the top, when it clicks as high as it can and then drops. We want to kind of use the roller coaster method. So we want to be expanding to build up the suspense as long as we can, stay in that good expansion spot as long as we can. People are working, people have money, businesses are thriving. And then once we get to a recession, when we know we're going to be kind of suffering economically, we want to get out as quickly as we can because we don't want people to suffer. All right, and then governments and banks and large banking institutions, like national ones, they work together to kind of slow us down and speed us up. They both have like different things that they can use, and we'll get into that later in fiscal and monetary policy. All right, and stay tuned for part 2.